she snapped at me in the middle of the living room, her voice sharp as glass breaking against tile. "Stop breathing so loud. You sound like you're dying." It was not the first time she had spoken to me that way, but it was the first time she stripped my very existence down to the sound of air leaving and entering my body. And in that moment, I felt the kind of humiliation that burns not on the surface, but deep in the marrow where memories live. I stared at her then, and I answered in a tone that did not rise above hers, but cut deeper. "And you sound like you're begging for the day I cut you off." Those words left my mouth without rehearsal, and yet they carried the weight of decades of swallowed silence. I am 74 years old. I live alone now in the house where I once raised her, though once it rang with children's footsteps, the hum of family dinners, and the sound of me running from room to room trying to keep everything stitched together, like an old quilt that was always threatening to unravel. Now the air inside it is still, heavy, and my breathing, my ordinary human breathing, was the crime that made me unworthy of her patience. I should tell you that I am not the kind of woman who ever demanded much from life. I grew up poor, in a house where even a sigh was considered wasteful if it interrupted someone else's sleep. I learned to move softly, to occupy less space, to carry burdens without complaint. When my daughter was born, I thought I was giving her the opposite of what I had: a childhood without fear, a home where she would never feel unwanted. I worked, I cooked. I bent myself into shapes that fit her needs. I gave her everything I had, and then some, because I believed motherhood was a kind of holy work, even if it left no monuments and no medals. And for a long time, I thought she loved me back. Maybe not always with words, but with the simple bond of a life carried inside me for 9 months and then carried outside me for decades more in ways she never noticed. But somewhere along the way, my sacrifices turned invisible, and I became not her mother, but a presence to be managed, tolerated, pushed aside when it no longer suited the picture she wanted her life to be. That day in the living room was not about breathing. Not really. Breathing was just the excuse, the surface reason, the visible thread pulled from a much larger fabric of rejection that had been woven over the years. The truth is that she had grown tired of me, tired of the way my body announces its age through every cough, tired of the way my memory sometimes falters, and I tell the same story twice, tired of the way my presence reminds her of what she will one day become. I saw it in her eyes before she even opened her mouth, the disgust not just for my breathing, but for the inevitability of her own aging reflected in me. It was not my noise that angered her, it was my existence. And what she did not know, what she could not see, was that her rejection of me was also her rejection of herself, of her future, of the mirror I had become. In that instant, when she flung her words at me, the years collapsed. I was no longer simply a 74-year-old woman being scolded for the sin of existing too loudly. I was also the woman who had once been told not to attend her school recital because I dressed old-fashioned, the woman who had been seated at the far end of her wedding reception because I did not fit into the polished photographs, the woman who had been asked not to hold her newborn too long because my hands, she said, smelled like ointment and age. I remembered each of those moments, the sting of them, the way I tried to swallow the pain and convince myself that she did not mean it, that she was tired or stressed or simply thoughtless. But this time was different. This time, She stripped away the last veil of politeness, and in doing so, she revealed the truth I had avoided. She did not want me here, not in her house, not in her life, not even in the air we both breathed. I stood there, looking at her face, the same face I had kissed when it was small and soft, the same mouth I had fed spoonfuls of soup to when she was sick, the same eyes that once looked at me with trust so complete it broke my heart with tenderness. And I realized with a clarity that almost frightened me that love can transform into something colder than hate. At least hate acknowledges existence. Indifference and irritation erase you altogether. She looked at me not as a mother, not even as a woman, but as an obstacle, as a piece of noise in an otherwise curated life. And what is more humiliating than being reduced to noise? When I answered her, when I told her she sounded like she was begging for the day I cut her off, I was not threatening her. I was announcing something to myself, something I had long buried under duty and guilt. I was saying that I could leave, that I could draw a line, that I could reclaim the small, stubborn dignity of choosing where and how my breathing would matter. My words surprised even me, because they did not come from anger, but from a quiet place of knowing, the place inside me that had been gathering strength while I pretended to be weak. I had not planned to say it, but it had been waiting all along, like a seed under frozen ground waiting for one strike of warmth. She stared back at me, shocked, maybe offended, maybe even afraid that I meant it, though I doubt she truly believed I had the courage. For so long, she had seen me as dependent, as frail, as the woman who would always stay, no matter how she was treated. But in that pause, in that small silence after my words, I felt the shift. I felt that I could walk away, that I could take the same lungs she found so irritating and carry them somewhere else, somewhere no one would shame me for being alive. I am 74, yes. I live alone now, yes. But that day in the living room, I was more alive than I had been in years, because for the first time in decades, I defended not my role, not my usefulness, not my service, but simply myself. My breath, my existence, my right to occupy space without apology. That was the day I realized that the sound of my breathing was not proof of dying. It was proof of living. And I would not let anyone, not even my daughter, take that from me again. The catalyst, the true breaking point, did not arrive with fireworks or a dramatic announcement, but in the slow and cruel clarity of words that cannot be unsaid. A single sentence from my daughter that reached into the softest place of me and pulled out the knowledge that I was no longer seen as a mother or even as a human being worthy of patience, but as a burden whose very breathing disturbed the delicate balance of her carefully constructed world. That afternoon, when she told me to stop breathing so loud, I stood in the middle of the room with my hands folded on my lap, pretending for a moment that I could simply brush off her cruelty as a mood, as exhaustion, as anything temporary, because I had lived my whole life finding excuses for the people I loved, smoothing their roughness until I was left bleeding inside. But this time, there was no disguise. Her words struck me like an official declaration, the moment of recognition that what had been building for years had now finally stepped out into the open, where it could no longer be denied. It is important to say that this was not sudden. Cruelty rarely arrives without rehearsal. My daughter had been training me for this dismissal for years in small ways that I did not dare name. When she insisted that I not speak too much at family dinners because my stories were too long, I obeyed. When she suggested I watch television in my bedroom instead of the living room because the grandchildren found the shows I liked boring, I agreed. When she rolled her eyes at the way I folded towels or criticized the soup I made for being too salty, I laughed it off as generational difference, never acknowledging the growing ache of being constantly corrected and minimized. But all those moments were rehearsals for the day when she would strip the politeness away and make the ultimate statement. My existence, my living body, my lungs moving air, were no longer welcome. That was the betrayal. Not the irritations, not the sighs, not even the disrespect, but the truth behind it. That she wished me silent, invisible, gone. I remember sitting there after she said it, staring at the rug under my feet, the rug I had bought 30 years ago, with money I saved from skipping lunches during workdays, back when I still thought that every object in the house was a testament to the family we were building. I looked at that rug and thought, how strange that the very ground I provided had turned into the stage for my humiliation. My daughter paced, busying herself with nothing in particular, refusing to look at me, already moving past the cruelty she had delivered as though it were casual, ordinary, something that did not need to be revisited. And that indifference was worse than the insult itself. If she had shouted, if she had cried, if she had begged forgiveness immediately, maybe I could have told myself it was a mistake. But she simply continued her day. And in that silence, I understood that the dismissal of me was not a momentary lapse. It was a decision. I wanted to remind her then, to tell her that I was the woman who carried her through fever nights, who worked double shifts to pay for her braces, who held her hand after her first heartbreak when she thought she could not live without a boy whose name she can no longer remember. I wanted to shake her into remembering that I had once been her center, her anchor, her shield. But as I opened my mouth, I realized that none of that mattered anymore. Memory is not a currency when love has been spent. I had been paying for years, pouring out everything I had, but she had already closed the account, and no deposit of reminders would make her value me again. The realization felt like a hollowing, as if I had been emptied out of my own history. And yet, inside that hollowness was a kind of clarity. Because betrayal, when it is finally spoken plainly, is not a wound alone. It is also a key. I had lived too long in the fog of pretending not to see what was happening, convincing myself that her coldness was my imagination, that the distance was temporary. But when she told me to stop breathing, she unlocked the truth. She wanted me erased, not just from the room, but from her life. And once you hear that truth, you cannot go back to unknowing it. I sat very still after she left the room, my chest rising and falling in the rhythm that she despised, and I listened to the sound of my own breath like it was evidence in a trial. Each inhale was proof that I was alive. Each exhale was proof that I would not disappear just because she wished it. It reminded me of the nights after my husband died, when I would lie awake in the dark and wonder if my body would remember how to keep going without his beside me. Back then, breathing was survival. Now, breathing was defiance. The catalyst was not only her words, but my response to them. The moment I realized that silence would no longer protect me, that my obedience had only made me smaller in her eyes, and that the only way to reclaim myself was to recognize that love can wither and respect can vanish, but dignity must be guarded like a flame in the wind. When I told her she sounded like she was begging for the day I cut her off, I was not threatening her with cruelty. I was promising myself freedom. It was the birth of a boundary I had never dared to imagine before. because I had spent my entire life believing that mothers do not leave, that mothers endure, that mothers are defined by sacrifice, even when it turns into their own burial. But in that instant, in the shadow of her dismissal, I understood that mothers are also women, and women can decide to walk away. That was the true betrayal and the true catalyst. Not only that my daughter reduced me to noise, but that in doing so, she set in motion the first step of my leaving. She thought she had silenced me, but she had, in fact, awakened me. And once awakened, I could never again pretend to be asleep. After that day in the living room, when my daughter finally said out loud what she had been saying in 100 quieter ways for years, the air between us shifted permanently, though she pretended nothing had changed, as if cruel words evaporate once. Spoken, but they do not evaporate. They settle into the walls, into the spaces between footsteps, into the sound of cutlery on plates. They turn a home into a place of quiet hostility where every gesture becomes charged with the weight of what has already been said. The escalation did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors, but with the slow, suffocating expansion of her irritations. The multiplication of rules that transformed me from a person into a disturbance that had to be managed, adjusted, corrected. Silenced. It began with the television. I had always watched my programs in the evenings. The same dramas and cooking shows that gave me comfort. The familiar voices of hosts who felt almost like friends after years of keeping me company in rooms where no one else wanted to sit. One evening, she came in and wrinkled her face as though the sound offended her. "Do you have to keep it so loud?" she asked. I reminded her gently that my hearing was not what it used to be, but she shook her head and snatched the remote from my hand, lowering the volume until the voices became whispers I could barely follow. "There," she said. "Better for everyone." I nodded, because what else could I do? But inside, I felt the sting. The television, my little window into a world that did not mock or diminish me, had been turned into yet another proof of my inconvenience. Then it was the kitchen. She began to complain about the way I cooked, the way I used too much salt, or stirred too slowly, or left crumbs on the counter. Once after I baked bread the way I always had, she pursed her lips and said, "We don't really eat heavy carbs anymore." She threw the loaf into the trash before anyone else could taste it. I wanted to protest, to say that I had baked bread since before she was born, that the smell of it rising in the oven was once her favorite thing in the world. But I stayed quiet, because I understood that she was not talking about bread. She was talking about me, about how I no longer fit into the slim, controlled life she curated. My bread was too heavy, just as I was too heavy, not in body perhaps, but in presence. She wanted things light, disposable, easy to digest, and I was none of those. Even in small domestic rituals, she found ways to remind me of my diminishing place. She criticized the way I folded laundry, as though precision in creases carried the weight of moral worth. She sighed loudly when I asked her to repeat something, making me feel guilty for the ears that had served me faithfully through years of listening to her childhood stories, her teenage sobs, her adult disappointments. She grew irritated when I repeated myself, as though memory lapses were sins I chose to commit. What she never understood was that repeating a story was not forgetfulness. It was a way of holding on to meaning, of trying to keep alive moments that had once mattered. But to her, every repetition was another flaw, another reason to roll her eyes. I began to shrink in response. I learned to turn the television off before she entered the room, to eat smaller portions so the sound of my chewing would not irritate her, to walk more softly down the hallway so that the creak of my knees would not betray me. I caught myself holding my breath when she passed behind me, as though silence could protect me from her disdain. It is a terrible thing to police your own breathing in your own home, to feel that every ordinary act of living has become ammunition for someone else's impatience. And yet, that was the shape my days began to take. What wounded me most was not even her words, but her glances. The way she looked at me across the room as if I were something out of place, an object that had been misplaced and left in view. There was no cruelty in her eyes, not exactly, only calculation and a faint annoyance. The same expression you might have toward a faucet that drips, no matter how many times you tighten it. To be looked at as a problem rather than a person is a slow death. I felt myself disappearing under her gaze, and what terrified me was how easily I let it happen, how quickly I learned to accept less space, less volume, less being. The grandchildren mirrored her indifference. They hardly spoke to me anymore, their eyes glued to their phones, their laughter shared in whispers I was not meant to understand. When I tried to ask them about school or friends, they answered with shrugs. Once, when I repeated a question because I had not heard the answer, my daughter snapped, "They already told you, Mom. Pay attention." The children giggled, and I laughed too, pretending it was all harmless, though inside I felt the cruel burn of being made into a joke. It is one thing to be invisible, another to be ridiculed. There were nights when I sat alone in my room, the door closed, listening to the murmur of their lives in the rest of the house. I could hear the clink of dishes, the bursts of laughter, the music playing from a speaker. I told myself they were just busy, that they did not mean to exclude me, but the truth was clear. I had become a guest in a home I had once built. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. The walls that once echoed with my footsteps now seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to press me smaller. And so the escalation was not a storm, but a steady rain, each drop wearing me down until I was soaked with humiliation. It was the accumulation of small dismissals, the constant erosion of dignity, the knowledge that I was no longer seen as a mother or even as a woman, but as background noise that needed to be muted. I felt myself retreating into silence, and in that silence a question began to form. How much longer would I allow myself to be erased? I did not yet have the answer, but the question itself was dangerous, because once asked, it cannot be unasked. And even in the quietest moments, even in the shrinking of myself to fit her demands, the seed of rebellion had already been planted. The night the change began did not announce itself with thunder or the clean certainty of a slammed door. It arrived on soft feet, the way fog slips into a harbor, and I remember lying awake with the lamp off, tracing the outline of the ceiling with my eyes while the house exhaled its shallow domestic noises, the refrigerator ticking, a pipe settling, a branch brushing the gutter, and beneath all of it, the steady rise and fall inside my chest, which, for months, I had treated like a trespass I must hide, until I understood that the sound my daughter despised was the only sound in the room that belonged wholly to me and could not be confiscated. And this realization, quiet, almost embarrassed to announce itself, was the hinge on which the next part of my life would turn. I placed my palm flat against my sternum and felt the dull, tidal push of breath, not elegant or perfectly measured, but loyal, persistent, mine. And for the first time since she told me to hush the simple machinery of life as if it were vulgar, I did not try to muffle it. Instead, I breathed a little deeper. And with that slightly larger breath, I remembered nights from her infancy when I would place her to my chest and count my inhales so she would follow. Because even then, I understood, without language, that bodies borrow courage from other bodies. And in the dark, I thought, if breath could once guide a child toward sleep, it could now guide a woman toward herself. The next morning, I did not perform anything radical by the standards of the world, but within the economy of my days, it was as shocking as a sail turning to catch wind. I rose earlier than usual, before her footsteps could colonize the hallway, and brewed coffee the way my mother taught me. Slow water over grounds, a patience that pulls aroma from bitterness, and I drank it at the kitchen table with the blinds half open, breathing as audibly as the kettle had, not to provoke her, not out of spite, but to test the idea that I might exist at my natural volume without apology. And when she entered with that quick, purposeful walk that always made me feel like a piece of furniture she planned to relocate, she glanced at me and then at the cup and said nothing, which seemed small. Yet in that wordless space, I recognized a sliver of territory reclaimed, and I folded it into myself like the first dollar in the drawer of a new shop. I washed the cup and left no trace on the counter, not because she demanded it, but because I chose to, and this distinction, invisible to anyone else, restored to me a sense of authorship over gestures that had begun to feel like court-ordered. Community service. The shift deepened in ways that could not be photographed. I began to keep a ledger in my head of what belonged to me by right and what I had surrendered out of habit. And most entries surprised me, because I had assumed for so long that survival required the erasure of preference. Yet when I stepped outside for the first walk I had taken without permission in months, the air did not scold me, and the street did not ask for a letter of justification. It simply received me with its ordinary. Morning noises, the thud of newspapers, the low whine of a distant leaf blower, the shy chatter of sparrows testing the cold. And I walked 3 blocks with my scarf tucked under my chin, and discovered that my legs did not resent me for forgetting them. They felt almost grateful to be asked. And by the time I returned to the house, I had decided I would walk again tomorrow, and the next day, because a woman can build a spine out of daily corridors if she repeats them long enough. I bought a small notebook at the pharmacy. Nothing pretty, just a stitched spine and a grid that promised order. And on the first page I wrote a date and a single sentence. Today I breathed like I meant it, then closed the cover as if I had stored a match there. At first, I thought the change would require speeches or confrontations, big scenes with broken crockery and declarations that shake chandeliers. But it turned out that the engine of my life turned best on smaller cogs. I moved my chair in the living room 2 feet toward the window and angled it so the light fell on my lap in the late afternoon. And in that patch of sun, I stitched a loose button and read 2 pages of a book that had sat, face down and ignored, for weeks. And when she came in and saw the chair moved, she opened her mouth as if to issue a correction, then closed it, perhaps because the legs had not scratched the floor, perhaps because the world had not tilted in its axis, and she let it be. And so did I, though I did not let the meaning be small, because autonomy often starts as imperceptible rearrangements of furniture that allow a different angle from which to see yourself. I stopped apologizing for not hearing, and instead of rushing to cover the lapse with nervous chatter, I simply asked her to repeat. and I noticed that when I did so without apology, she sometimes repeated, without sighing, as if my shame had been the metronome to which her contempt kept time. At night, I practiced a ritual that seemed childish at first, but it became the foundation under all of the days that followed. Before sleep, I would sit on the bed and count to 4 as I inhaled. Hold to 4. Exhale to 4. Hold again, a square of breath that smoothed the frayed edge of my thoughts. And as I traced that quiet geometry, I would speak softly to the girl I had been, when my hands were quick and my back did not mutter at me, telling her I had not abandoned her, that her efforts were seen, that there was still a life remaining in which gentleness toward herself could be the rule rather than the exception. And in answering myself this way, I found I slept with fewer startles, as if the house inside me had stopped expecting raids. In the mornings, I wrapped a scarf she once called dowdy, wool the color of tea leaves, around my neck, not for warmth alone, but because it smelled faintly of cedar, and the familiarity steadied me, a soft armor no one else could recognize. The midpoint of a life rarely announces its page number, yet I could feel that I had crossed from the country of appeasement into the country of choice when I quietly gathered my essential papers: a birth certificate, a worn passport with more stamps, of hospitals than of airports, the deed photocopy I had kept like a talisman, even though it concerned a different chapter, and placed them in a folder. I slid beneath the sweaters she never touched because they smelled of me. This was not an escape plan, not yet. It was a rehearsal of readiness, a way of reminding myself that I was not trapped by incompetence but held by habit, and habit can be broken if you give your hands a new choreography. I set aside cash in an envelope, as if paying myself a small wage for the labor of becoming visible again. And each bill, however modest, cooled the panic that had long simmered under the surface of my obedience. I also began the strange and difficult work of speaking differently to my daughter, not with barbs or the exhausted righteousness that so quickly curdles into self-pity, but with the kind of measured clarity I once reserved for doctors and landlords, sentences that did not apologize for existing, which is harder than people think when you have trained your mouth to soften your edges so others won't cut themselves on your needs. When she corrected the way I stacked plates, I said, without rush, that I preferred to do it the way my hands remembered, and then I continued, and when she pointed out the volume of the television, I did not defend or plead. I simply turned on captions and left the sound where I could hear it. And if she frowned, the sky did not fall. And because catastrophe did not arrive, my nervous system learned to anticipate something other than punishment. There was a day, and I mark it now as a quiet turning, when I brought home a small plant from the corner shop, a pothos with leaves mottled like light underwater, and I set it on the kitchen sill where the window sulks in the afternoons, and I watered it with the leftover inch of my tea. It was nothing extravagant, yet even that inch was a declaration that some portion of my day would be spent on growth rather than on repair. She glanced at the pot and asked whose it was, and I said mine. And she said the sill looked cluttered, and I said the sill looked alive. And we did not speak further, but the green stayed, and each new leaf felt like a vote. I did not become fearless. I became attentive. I listened, not to her temperature, which changed like weather I could not influence, but to the instruments inside, the barometer of my breath, the compass of my posture, the clock of my fatigue. And when the readings suggested storm, I postponed difficult conversations instead of walking into the downpour because duty told me the umbrella of self-respect was selfish. I returned phone calls when my voice felt like it belonged to me. And if the grandchildren texted from rooms away, I answered with voice notes, not to force them into my medium, but to remind my throat it still had work worth doing. In this slow, deliberate accumulation of choices, the midpoint revealed itself not as a single decisive scene, but as a corridor of doors, each one leading to a room where I could stand without shrinking. And once I had stood in a handful of such rooms. I knew that the house of my life could be rearranged, that I could, if necessary, walk out of the front door and not dissolve in the air like breath on a cold day. I did not tell her any of this, because not all knowing must be shared. And sometimes, the safest way to protect a small flame is to cup it from the wind of other people's disbelief. So I kept breathing, as if each inhale were a stitch, and each exhale were the thread pulled through. And in this long seam, I recognized the shape of my own name returning to me, syllable by syllable, as if I were being called back from a distance I had mistaken for fate. The shift I had felt, the fragile but undeniable sense of reclamation that began with my own breath and a cup of coffee in the quiet of morning, was tested sooner than I expected. For the world has a way of sending reminders that freedom is never offered without challenge. And if the first part of my awakening was private and almost invisible, the second escalation arrived like a draft under a closed door. Subtle at first, but growing, until the whole room trembled with it. My daughter must have sensed that something in me had changed, for she began to push harder, as if determined to remind me that in her eyes I was still the dependent, the tolerated, the inconvenience she believed she could control. And what had once been occasional complaints sharpened into strategies, not always spoken directly, but woven into the fabric of our days, so that I was constantly aware of the pressure to retreat again into silence. It began with a suggestion, framed in the voice of concern but carrying the blunt edge of eviction. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen, my plant on the sill stretching its leaves toward the last scraps of sunlight, she poured herself a glass of water and said casually, "You know, Mom, there are places where people your age can really thrive. Communities, you know, places where you'd have friends, people to talk to, activities. Maybe you'd be happier somewhere like that instead of rattling around here." She smiled as if it were generosity she offered, but her eyes betrayed her impatience. I knew at once what she meant. She wanted me out of the house, not because I was lonely, but because my presence irritated her. The kindness of her phrasing was just a costume for the rejection underneath. I did not answer immediately. I sipped my tea and looked at the plant, its small veins illuminated by the window's dying light. And for a moment, I remembered the countless nights I had sat with her fevers, the endless hours in waiting rooms, the jobs I had worked to cover her needs. I remembered the sound of her voice when she was little, calling for me in the dark. And now, here she was, rehearsing the polite vocabulary of abandonment. I told her simply that I was fine where I was. My voice did not tremble, and that frightened her more than any protest would have, because it was the voice of a woman who had begun to detach, and she must have sensed it. But she did not stop. Over the next weeks, the pressure grew. She left brochures on the counter, glossy images of silver-haired people playing cards or stretching in classes, as if pictures of strangers could lure me out of my own home. When I ignored them, she shifted tactics, mentioning the cost of keeping the house, the inconvenience of maintaining so many rooms, the noise of my television bleeding through the walls. Each comment was a pebble dropped into a jar, and the weight of them accumulated until the jar was almost full. I knew where this was leading. She wanted me gone, but she also wanted to be blameless, to make it seem as though I had chosen to leave. The grandchildren began to echo her tone, though not maliciously, more as parrots of the environment they lived in. "Grandma, why don't you live with other grandmas?" one of them asked once, their eyes wide with innocence, but the cruelty of the question was not lessened by its source. Children repeat what they hear, and what they had heard over and over was that my presence was temporary, burdensome, an awkward fit. It hurt, more than I can say, to realize that even in their young memories, I would not be the grandmother who baked bread or told stories, but the grandmother who stayed too long in a house where no one wanted her. The escalation deepened when she began to comment on my health in ways that were not observations, but accusations. "You cough too much. Are you sure you're okay? You breathe heavily when you climb the stairs. Maybe it's not safe for you here. I worry about you being alone in the house if something happens." All framed as worry, all dressed in the clothing of care. But I knew what she was doing. She was rehearsing the argument that I could not take care of myself, that the house was unsafe, that her decision to send me away would not be cruelty, but necessity. The most painful part was not even the content of her words, but the performance of them, the way she wanted me to collude in my own removal, to nod and admit that I was frail, to give her the satisfaction of believing she was acting in my best interest. But I could not give her that. One night, after another thinly veiled lecture about options for the future, I went to my room and opened the drawer where I had hidden my folder of papers. I spread them out on the bed like weapons. My birth certificate, my identification, the photocopy of the deed that reminded me I had been the foundation for her very security, and the small stash of bills I had been tucking away. I counted them slowly, not because the number changed, but because the ritual reminded me of possibility. The money was not much, but it was mine, and in those bills I felt more freedom than in all the rooms of that house. I slid the envelope back into the drawer and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing deliberately, not quietly, until my chest expanded against my nightgown. I thought, she wants me silent. She wants me erased. But here I am, filling the room with air. The real escalation, though, came not from her words, but from her silences. She began to move through the house without addressing me directly, as though I were already gone. She would speak to the children in my presence without acknowledging that I sat 2 feet away. She would pour herself a drink and ask no one in particular if they wanted one, but never look at me. She began to plan outings with the children, speaking of them as family trips, without including me in the conversation. It was as though she were rehearsing a version of life in which I was no longer part of the cast. That, more than anything, told me my time there was ending. I had to test myself to see if I was ready, so I performed small acts of rebellion. I took longer walks, disappearing for hours without explanation. I cooked a meal the old way, with butter and salt, and placed it on the table without apology. I turned the television to my shows and left the volume where I needed it, captions on, but sound steady. The sky did not fall. She fumed, of course, made small comments, but I noticed something new. Her power depended on my compliance. Without my shame, her irritation was toothless. And that realization, that her control had always been a performance I enabled, gave me a strength I had not felt in years. Still, the pressure mounted. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room, she said in a voice meant to sound calm but edged with finality, "Mom, We need to talk about the future. This isn't working. You're not happy here. I can see it, and neither are we. Maybe it's time to make a change." She paused, waiting for me to crumble, to admit she was right. I looked at her and said nothing. Silence stretched, heavy as stone, until she shifted uncomfortably. I saw, for the first time, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Perhaps she realized then that I was not the passive woman she believed I would always be. The second escalation was not only her growing campaign to push me out, but my own quiet refusal to bend. It was a test of wills, fought in the spaces between sentences, in the positioning of chairs, in the volume of a television, in the presence of a plant on a windowsill. She wanted me erased, but I was learning to insist, with every breath, with every gesture, that I was still here. The cost of that insistence was high. Every day carried tension, every conversation the risk of fracture. But the reward was the slow, deliberate return of myself to myself. And so I lived in that charged atmosphere, the house no longer a home, but a battleground of subtle wars, each of us maneuvering for space, for control, for the right to define what my life should look like. She thought she was breaking me down. In truth, she was sharpening me, and though I did not yet know what form it would take, I understood that the day was coming when words would no longer suffice, when I would have to choose not just how to breathe, but where, and with whom, and for how long. The day of reckoning came not with warning, but with the slow inevitability of something that has been waiting too long behind a locked door, pressing outward until the hinges give way. It was a Sunday morning, pale light slanting through the curtains, the house wrapped in the usual atmosphere of half-busy, half-bored silence, when my daughter once again raised her voice about the sound of me living. This time, it was not just my breathing, though that was the trigger. It was the clatter of my cup against the table, the rhythm of my footsteps on the kitchen tile, the scrape of a chair leg that she swore I dragged deliberately to irritate her. She came into the room with that look she carried now, the one that measured me not as a person, but as a nuisance. And she said, with that false patience that pretends to be kindness while dripping poison underneath, "I can't do this anymore, Mom. I can't live in a house where every sound you make reminds me of decay. You need to think seriously about moving out. This isn't fair to anyone." Her words floated in the air, heavier than smoke, and I felt something inside me rise. Not in anger, not in desperation, but in a steadiness that had been rehearsed for months in the privacy of my breathing, my notebook, my quiet acts of rebellion. I did not argue with her, did not remind her of all I had given, did not beg her to reconsider. I simply stood up, walked to my room, and opened the closet where my suitcase waited, half packed with the essentials I had been gathering like a squirrel hiding nuts before winter. The handle felt cool and certain in my hand. I pulled it into the hallway, its wheels rolling over the wooden floor with a sound that seemed louder than any complaint she had ever lodged against me, a sound of decision, of movement, of finality. She followed me, eyes wide, voice sharp. "What are you doing?" she demanded, as though she could not believe that the mother who had always stayed, who had always bent, could now straighten her spine. I set the suitcase by the door and placed my keys on the table, the same table where I had once laid out her birthday cakes, her homework, her wedding invitations. My hand lingered for a moment on the cool metal, the weight of it a symbol of ownership and responsibility. And then I let it go. "This is your house now," I told her, my voice even, almost gentle. But my life is mine again. For a heartbeat, she looked at me as though I were a stranger, and in that look, I saw the girl she had been vanish completely, replaced by the woman who could not bear the sight or sound of me. She opened her mouth to argue, to pull me back into the cage of guilt where she had kept me for years, but no words came. Perhaps she sensed that this time there was nothing she could say, that the tide had turned in a way beyond her control. The children stood at the foot of the stairs, staring, their faces pale with confusion, perhaps even fear, because they had never seen me claim space, never seen me choose myself over the comfort of others. I did not linger. I did not give speeches or explanations. I lifted the handle of the suitcase and opened the door, letting the cool air rush in, carrying with it the scent of grass and the faint hum of traffic. It felt like stepping into another country, though the street was the same one I had walked for years. My heart beat not with panic, but with an unfamiliar steadiness, as though it had been waiting for this departure. I crossed the threshold, and behind me I heard her call out, her voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You won't survive on your own." I did not answer, because I knew the truth now. Survival is not measured by dependence on others, but by to breathe without shame. And as I walked down the path, suitcase trailing behind me, my breath filled the morning like music. I made no dramatic gestures, no backward glances. The moment was not about her, not even about what I was leaving behind, but about the irrevocable fact that I was moving forward. The sound of the suitcase wheels on the pavement was steady, like a drumbeat announcing a march. And with each step, I felt the weight of years slip from my shoulders. The weight of silences swallowed, insults endured, invisibility accepted. By the time I reached the end of the street, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The climax was not in the confrontation itself, not in her words or mine, but in the action that could not be undone. Once I walked out that door, there was no return. Not because I was incapable of going back, but because dignity, once reclaimed, cannot be surrendered again without killing the very spirit that rose to claim it. She could call me stubborn, ungrateful, dramatic. She could tell stories to others about how difficult I had become, how unreasonable. Let her. What mattered was that I had written my own ending to the chapter she thought she controlled. And as I reached the bus stop, setting the suitcase beside me on the bench, I realized with a calm that surprised me that I was not afraid. The unknown stretched before me, vast and uncharted. But it was mine. I breathed deeply, audibly, filling my lungs with air that belonged to no one but me. And for the first time in many years, I did not lower my breath to please another soul. I did not arrive anywhere grand, only a modest room at the back of a boarding house that smelled faintly of boiled rice and lemon cleaner, with a window that opened onto a narrow alley where the afternoon sun stalled as if catching its breath before setting. And yet the first night I lay down on the bed, springs creaking like an old friend stretching after a long ride, I felt a quietness I had not met in years, a quietness that did not ask me to disappear inside it. In the morning, I woke before the traffic warmed and made coffee in the chipped kettle the landlady kept for tenants who still insisted on water and steam rather than buttons and beeps. And I stood with my mug at the window, letting the air move over, my face in a way that made the whole day feel undecided and therefore generous. And I thought, so this is what it means when no one is waiting to measure my volume or count my steps or correct the angle of my chair. This thin light and the steam rising from the cup are not much by the standards of photographs, but they are enough by the standards of a life. I unpacked slowly, not because there was much to sort, but because I wanted to give each small possession the ceremony I had always denied myself. Folding my cardigan over the back of the single chair, tucking my notebook into the desk drawer, placing my plant, the pothos that had earned its right to travel with me, on the sill where it might find courage in the pale stripe of sun that crossed the wall around noon. And when I finished, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the room breathe. With me, the building settling, pipes whispering, footsteps from above like distant rain. And I realized that for the first time in a long time, my body did not brace for intrusion. Days were simple, and they were mine. I learned the rhythm of the street quickly. The bakery that released warm air at 7 and sold yesterday's loaves for coins. The small library that hummed with the kind of optimism only books can afford. The park. Bench that took the midday light like a benediction, and in those small circuits, I felt my pulse line up with the world in a way that asked nothing of me but presence. I opened an account at a neighborhood branch and slid across the counter. The bills I had protected like embers, and the young teller with a silver ring through her brow counted them without the faintest flinch of condescension, passing back a receipt, as if to say, "You belong to the arithmetic of your own choices." I found work of the humble kind that rewards showing up instead of shining, the morning hours that keep a person honest, pouring coffee and wiping tables and remembering the names of 3 regulars who like their toast the color of tea. And when my feet ached at noon, I understood it as the ache of muscles that had been asked to carry a woman forward, not the ache of a heart that has been asked to step aside. I bought a second-hand coat and slid my hands into its deep pockets and felt something close to ceremony, because choosing a garment for the body that others had tried to make small is a kind of testimony. And on Sundays, I washed it carefully in the sink and hung it over the radiator, and the rising heat made the room smell like wool and soap and perseverance. I wrote letters I did not send, and a few I did. The unsent ones were to the versions of myself I had mislaid. The girl who thought patience was the only proof of love. The mother who mistook endurance for devotion. The woman who agreed to be everyone's soft landing while denying herself a place to fall. And I told each of them that I had not betrayed them by walking away, that leaving was the truest continuation of what they had always wanted, a life where kindness does not require self-erasure. The posted letters were short and careful, one to my grandson with a line about the book he had mentioned, and a promise that if he ever came to see me, he would find me not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence. One to a woman from the old neighborhood, who used to pass me coupons at the market, telling her I had changed addresses and that I hoped she was still putting extra thyme in her soup, because time in soup and time in life both require an unapologetic simmer. I did not write to my daughter, not out of malice, but out of accuracy. Sometimes the most honest sentence is the one withheld, the space where a reply might sit, but does not. And that white space, like a held breath, becomes the punctuation that finally makes the paragraph true. The nights grew less tense and then almost kind. I learned to leave the window open a finger's width so the room could trade air with the dark, and I lay down without rehearsing what I should have said or what I must say tomorrow. And when I woke, it was because morning had happened, not because fear had shaken me awake with its urgent inventory, And in that simple sequence of sleep and waking, I recognized what safety feels like when it is not handed to you as permission, but generated from within. Sometimes, when the kettle clicked off and the alley filled with the clatter of bottles or laughter from the back door of the restaurant 2 buildings over, I would think of the old house, not with longing and not with judgment, only with the kind of distant attention one gives to a map after choosing a different road. And I would wish them well the way you wish weather well, understanding it will behave as it pleases regardless of your hope. If there is a message to be carried from this small room to any woman who finds herself counting her breaths so someone else will not accuse her of noise, it is this: you are not the echo of their comfort. You are the instrument of your own life. And the hand that turns the dial down on your voice cannot reach the place where your lungs decide to rise. And if you are waiting for a permission slip stamped with courage, let my ordinary days be enough. Let the vision of a chipped cup and a plant on. A sill and a coat hung carefully on a nail prove that freedom often arrives looking like routine. You do not owe anyone the performance of collapse to justify your leaving. You do not need to rehearse a speech to earn the right to stand. You do not need to be young to begin again. You need only to recognize the moment your body tells you the price of staying has exceeded the value of peace. And then, with all the gentleness you once lavished on others, grant yourself the dignity of departure. When I think of the woman I was the day she told me to stop breathing so loud, I want to cup her face and tell her that sound you are ashamed of is the oldest promise you ever made to yourself, the one you kept even when the room insisted otherwise. And that somewhere a window will open for you, and on the sill a leaf will turn toward the light, and you will stand beside it and learn again how to draw air without apology. And when you do, write to me, even if only in your head, and say, Here I am not quiet, and I am free.